My name is Julie Nowinski. I'm the head of adult services here at Clarke Library, and on behalf of the North Carolina Room staff, the North Carolina Room Friends of the Library, I would like to welcome you to the third program in our series of 6 programs about Asheville in the 1980s, a formative decade told by those who shaped it. These programs, through various conversations over time, these programs came about because we realized that in the North Carolina Room we didn't have very much information about the 1980s, and many of us, were kind of checking our memories because we didn't always remember it as such our memories kind of were inconsistent with the downtrodden portrait always portrayed of Asheville. And so we were curious to see if, how those actually meshed with what actually happened. So these programs are to help us begin to document and archive that decade in Asheville's history. And it's to also, so we have a historical record of what happened, because the 80s were a very critical turning point in that center city, particularly Asheville's history. So the implications of those decisions kind of reverberate now, and as librarians and historians and everything, we believe that more information about the past is good for people who are trying to make decisions for the future. And so to further that, if you have photos, if you are part of an organization, especially tonight is our social agencies and social activism, if you have pictures, newsletters, any kind of information that you would like for us to, you can either share it with us to scan or give to us, we would love to have that, because these programs are just the beginning of trying to create a more full historic record for our collection here at the library. So our first program was Save Downtown Asheville and the Wrap, and it addressed the Strauss-Greenberg Mall that was proposal, and then the wrap that was created to kind of define the space that actually was at risk so that people could visualize it. And so that was our first program. Last month we had Asheville business people who stayed in the center city when others were going out to the mall and other places, and also those who started new businesses, and we like to call them the early investors. Maybe they didn't have a ton of money, but they had time and energy and ideas. And they opened businesses in less than ideal circumstances, but as we see today, they actually began an ideal community that sort of blossomed into what Asheville is today. Tonight's program focuses on social agencies and social activism. We feel like these sort of define the heart of Asheville, and they laid the foundation for a compassionate and engaged community that we have today. So I'd like to thank the North Carolina Room Friends of the Library. They support us so well. We encourage you to, there are membership forms at the back. We encourage you to look into joining that organization. All the money from that goes directly to support programming and other needs for the North Carolina Room. I'd like to thank the North Carolina Room staff who's worked so hard on this. I'd also like to thank all of our panelists, our moderators, and our guests who are donating their time and who have embraced this project. Let's see, I was given lots of notes to, there's some surveys at the back of the room. If you were part of a nonprofit and you were given a survey and you haven't filled it out, or if you didn't receive one, that we would like information about that to put into the North Carolina Room collection, just to have that. Let's see. I just like now to introduce Ann Von Brock. She's been deeply involved in the community since she moved here in 1978. She was a volunteer at Rape Crisis in the 80s, a volunteer in late 70s and 80s, a volunteer at Helpmate. She's an executive director of Helpmate from 1982 to 1986. She was a coordinator of the YWCA Women's Center in 1986, and then went with United Way in 1987. So I'm going to turn it over to Ann. And thank you all for being here.
Clarke Library for all the work that they've done to put this series together. It was a fascinating focus of all of the things that happened during the, we're going to talk about the 70s and the 80s really, because there was such significant overlap in those 2 decades. But a lot happened in that time, and so we're going to try to touch on it and pique your interest. If you want to know more about it, the North Carolina Room will hopefully have a really well-built archive about those times. We've asked nonprofit agencies to submit a summary of their history so that they can have that on file. So any that haven't, if you're here tonight, please do so, so that the library and the county will have this record of what happened during that time. I'd love to get a sense of everybody in the room and how long you all have been in Asheville. So if I can have a show of hands of people who have just been here, say 1 to 5 years. Okay, great. Welcome. Welcome. Glad you're here. 5 to 10 years. Great. 10 to 15. 15 to 20. 20 to 40. Great. What about people who are natives to Buncombe County? That's great. That's great. And what about people who work in nonprofits in the 70s and 80s on social issues? All right. Yeah. Great. A great mixture. So we've got some expertise in the audience, we've got some history, and we've also got some folks who want to learn about the community. So that's a great combination. What we're going to do is, Clarke is my co-moderator. I'm going to make a few remarks, and then she is, and then we're going to go down the row and have each person talk for a bit about their experience in working in social activism and social agencies in the 70s and the 80s. We'll have, we've got some resource folks here. If people can add to what we touch on, we'll call on them, and then we'll have some question and answer time with the audience. So hopefully we can move through all of that by 7:30. As Julie said, I moved here in 1978, and with a background in sociology, it was probably only right that I get involved in social issues. And there were a lot of things happening in the 70s and the 80s to get involved with. It was, as I said, a very exciting time. When we think about social issues, we think about, there were some slides here earlier, but things like pollution, civil rights, women's rights, economic justice, etc. So there were many things to get your hands around and get involved with. When we talk about social activism, I was reminded recently that means doing something. It doesn't mean just talking about it, it means doing something and actually getting involved. And so the people that you're going to hear from tonight are the doers, the folks who really took action on issues that they were concerned about and tried to make the community a better place. As I said, it's a big topic. We're going to skim the surface, and we hope that will stimulate some further discussion. But a general sense of social action can be seen if you just look at the development of nonprofits. And I think most of you have the handout of the timeline that we put together. And I will tell you it is incomplete. And if there are things missing, we hope you will tell us and we can fill it out. But it was a good start. And just as a broad brush examination of that timeline, between 1889 and 1969, so a span of 80 years, in Asheville, there were 16 organizations that we identified as nonprofits that were social action groups. Between 1970 and 1989, 20-year span as opposed to an 80-year span, there were 35 organizations that were introduced to Buncombe County. So it was a busy time, there was a lot happening, and a lot of organizations came into being because they saw a void. Something was missing in the community that needed to be addressed, and so it was important to take action on those things. One of the stories that I would like to share with you all about Asheville in the 70s and 80s in our social activism is Anita Tucker, who was the shelter manager for Helpmate, left our organization, moved to Greensboro, and was part of a number of statewide coalitions and task forces. And she came back to tell me one time that she had learned that the buzz around the state was whenever you had a statewide meeting and the folks came in from Asheville, there were 3 ways you could tell they were from Asheville. One was they first of all complained about how far they had to drive for such a short meeting. The The second one was that you discovered that they were already doing everything that anybody else in the state was doing and doing it better. And the third thing was if they were female, they had dangly earrings. So that's how we were known around the state in that era. Okay, so let me introduce the panel to you, and they're going to tell you a little bit more about themselves. Clarke is my co-moderator. She is the founding executive director of Western Carolinians for Criminal Justice, now retired, but certainly got that program underway. Jim Barrett is the executive director of Pisgah Legal Services. John Hayes is not here yet. We hope he'll show up. He is the CEO of WRES Radio, so we hope he will get here before the evening is over, but we will move on. Deborah Miles is the executive director for Diversity Education. Jeff Oakes is the publisher for Mountain Express. And Galen Ehrlichman is the retired health educator from Buncombe County. All of them were involved in a number of different organizations, and they're going to touch on the ones that they were most involved with. So I'm going to turn it over to Ellen.
Thank you, Ann. I don't usually talk in a microphone. I usually don't need one, but I hope everyone can hear me okay. Is this good for everybody? First of all, let me say that really Ann is the prime mover of this event tonight. She's generous to share the responsibility of moderator with me, but really, as they say in the trade, I just carry her briefcase, and we're next door neighbors. So there are other reasons to be together, but Ann really deserves so much credit for pulling us together and staying with this project, which has just been so enriching to our community, these sessions, and we look forward to the ones that are coming after us. 2 more, I think, after we are done. Okay, so tonight we're going to look at kind of an intersection of social activism and social agencies that described Asheville in the 70s and 80s. So to start with, let's just consider a few questions that pertain to all of us on the panel. And then I'll get into a little bit about what I was doing here in that time. So a question I began to ask myself as I was organizing my thoughts tonight began with, what do we on this panel have in common when we arrived here in the late 70s, early 80s? Well, first of all, we have a native Ashevillean on our panel, which I just learned tonight. Galen is from Asheville. Grandparents lived in Kenilworth. She moved on to Boone and then came back and has been working here and retired all these years. But except for Galen, the rest of us were newcomers, like many of you here tonight. When we got here, we were just getting started with our vocations in our careers. We were looking to put down roots. We are passionate about justice. We're problem solvers. And turns out we were risk takers. What did we find here or return to when we got to Asheville? A small mountain city that became our home. Like many of you, we've lived and worked here longer than any other place we've lived. Occasionally these days we do the math and are shocked. So what did we do? We arrived with a resume, a passion, some experience, a vision about a just and livable community for all. Some of us were already hired. Others found work. We got into our toolbox. We volunteered with each other's endeavors. We joined churches, synagogues, neighborhood associations, the PTO, the school board. We did precinct work. We met with compatriots. We collaborated, and occasionally we ruffled feathers. Along the way, our activism and outreach became a platform and a context for the development of new social service programs and agencies, some of which you'll hear about tonight. And statistic, I think, about this work we've done bears repeating. That is, it took to talk about tonight, and that really has laid the groundwork, we believe, for the Asheville that we experience today. So there's a fancy word these days for folks like us. And depending upon whom you're talking about, he or she may embrace the term with some measure of comfort. What am I talking about? The fancy new word? Social entrepreneurs. Now, I'm not talking about breweries here. We're not doing that tonight. But instead, social entrepreneurs who combine business or organizational activities with humanitarian, environmental, and community goals. Just like for-profit business entrepreneurs, we have organized and managed our projects with considerable initiative and risk. We've acted as manager and overseen the launch and growth of our organizations. We've identified opportunities and acquired and deployed necessary resources for their success. With a great deal of help, we've developed business plans, hired staff, acquired financial and material resources, provided leadership, and borne responsibility for the program's success or failures. What's essential, however, to our kind of entrepreneurship has been a focus on community. Ours are and were collaborative public service organizations whose success or profits, if you will, belong to all the people. So, activists, rabble-rousers, community organizers, human service professionals, collaborators, social entrepreneurs. Whatever the moniker, all of us on your panel tonight are tremendously proud to call Asheville home. And we remain grateful for the generosity, support, wisdom, and patience that has nourished our work over all these many years. So, welcome again to our program tonight. Now I'm here to talk for a few minutes about the work that I did in Asheville. And it's interesting to have been involved in work that was a crisis when I arrived, and it's a crisis today. It's called mass incarceration. Or as they say on death row, them without the capital get the punishment. That's no less true today than it was in 1977 when I moved here along with Tony Sayer to help develop and direct the jail and prison ministry as a new program of ABCCM, the Asheville Buncombe Community Christian Ministry. Then in 1977, Robert Wilshire was the ABCCM Executive Director, and Sheriff Tom Marcy chaired our search committee. I worked with ABCCM for about 5 years, and it was a tremendous experience. We recruited, trained, and placed volunteers in the old jail, which, as many of you remember, consisted of the top 5 floors of the Buncombe County Courthouse. And our job and opportunity was to provide an array of services to prisoners on the cell blocks. One of those, for example, was in collaboration with AB Tech and, of course, the sheriff. We had to have his permission, but really, Marcy was a visionary in some ways, and he really was committed to this whole concept of adult education. So, Tony and I worked together with AB Tech to establish the first adult basic education class in a North Carolina jail. How about that? AB Tech provided certified teachers, our volunteers served as aides, and when the students were ready to take their exam, deputies took them in handcuffs from the jail to AB Tech to take their equivalency exam. It's an amazing time. Volunteers also took a library cart full of paper bags and materials around the cell blocks. Often they were the only visitors prisoners had. We took messages to their lawyers, occasionally spoke on their behalf at sentencing hearings, 1980 and 1982. I was able to reconnect with college and graduate school friends who were doing a lot of new and fairly radical work in the area of prison reform, the death penalty, and mass incarceration. And there was a group called the Southern Coalition on Jails and Prisons that we were affiliated with and met with regularly over the Highlander Center in Tennessee. Another group we worked with was the North Carolina Prison and Jail Project, who, along with the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation, pulled together the Citizens Commission on Alternatives to Incarceration, or the Witcher Commission, which was established from 1980 to 1982 as a fact-finding and public policy initiative with the responsibility to address North Carolina's prison overcrowding crisis. A crisis that was real and so severe that the entire correctional system was in danger of being taken over by a federal court master because of egregious conditions in prison units across the state, including our old Clarke prison that was so unsafe, dilapidated, and overcrowded that the new Secretary of Correction, who just come in 1980 to oversee prisons in all the state, came from Colorado, was quoted in the Asheville Citizen as saying, as a farmer before he went to school and became a prison superintendent, he would never house farm animals at a place like Clarke Prison. Needless to state, he did not stay long in North Carolina as our Secretary of Correction, but he spoke the truth, and it was a really pretty rough place. So at any rate, this group of people that I worked with, including legislators, judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, on and on, were looking at what we could do to address this issue of, really, we call it now mass incarceration. And the way we looked at that was to go across the country and look at new initiatives that had to do with pretrial release, pretrial diversion, sentencing alternatives, and reentry support. The Reynolds Foundation had not just set up this commission, they had set aside money to implement those projects. We wanted to see one started in Buncombe County in Asheville with the Public Defender's Office. I was eager to get that work started. ABCCM declined the opportunity to do that, so some volunteers and I went out on our own and we established an organization called Western Carolinians for Criminal Justice. We applied to be a funded site. The Prison and Jail Project in Derham was our fiscal sponsor. We got a 501c3 status by the end of 1982, and we began our programming in 1983. Now, from 1983 until 2013, 30 years that organization worked in Buncombe County in the 28th District, over the mountains in the 29th and 30th Districts, with this focus of identifying people who are ready to work on issues that got them in trouble, and we found resources for them to use in addressing those issues. We put them together a proposal, and we gave them to lawyers like John Bird, who was the Public Defender's Office, and said, here's what we can do for your client, see if you can get them on probation, and we'll get started with their support and services. It was a very successful program. The recidivism rate was low, the support was high, but for programs like ours to continue, it required a public-private partnership. Foundation money, United Way, was generous. The legislature was progressive until it wasn't. And we know about that today. So rather than feeling prideful about programs such as our Blood Women at Risk program that remained for years the only funded outpatient mental health and substance use treatment program for women in North Carolina, women out of prison in North Carolina, you look around one day and realize that you're the last program and the only program that's being funded by the state, and you know soon that's going to be withdrawn as well. So unfortunately, that's what has happened in the last few years. There's not that energy and cooperation and vision at the state level, but perhaps that will change, and we can get back to doing some of this good work at the end. So I want to just thank you. I'm way past my time, but I want to thank you for your interest in this work, and to tell you that it makes a huge difference in people's lives when communities such as ours band together and try to problem solve, think outside the box, hitch up our trousers, and get to work. Thank you.
It's an honor to be here. I'm Jim Barrett, and I'm currently the Director of Physical Legal Services, where I've worked since 1983. And it feels like a lot of you people should be up here instead of me, because you all did a lot of hard work. Physical Legal Services just served 15,000 people last year for the first time, and we did that with 12,000 volunteer hours, 300 volunteer lawyers, and 50 staff. And as you know, we help people meet basic needs to stop domestic violence, prevent homelessness, and access health care primarily. Physical Legal Services grew out of local attorneys' volunteer program that was operated informally by a committee of attorneys starting in the 1960s, as best I can tell. Judges would contact this committee and ask the committee to parcel out the services or farm out the services, the cases to volunteer attorneys. Some of you know lawyers who were involved in this project in the 1970s, Carl Strauss, Bill Wolcott, and Larry Deborah, for example. Meanwhile, in the war on poverty in the 1960s and 70s, the Office of Economic Opportunity in the federal government was established, and many of you know way more about that than I do. But as an outgrowth of that, the Legal Services Corporation was created by Congress. And I understand that was the last law that Richard Nixon signed before he was run out of office. And I think at that point he could appreciate the need for legal. So the Legal Services Corporation was created to fund legal aid programs in all counties in the United States. However, thinly, they were to be spread. The thinking was that if low-income people had access to legal counsel, the playing field could be leveled somewhat so that they could have stable housing, avoid consumer rip-offs, remedy discrimination, organize community development organizations, and do other efforts to address the causes and symptoms of poverty. So when this opportunity to apply for federal funds for legal aid programs arose, Bill Wolcott was commissioned by the local bar to submit an application on behalf of the bar. Their rather innovative idea was to pay reduced legal fees to a panel of lawyers in what was to be called a Judicare model, sort of a takeoff on Medicare. Edward Hay was the first director of Physical Legal Services, and many of you know that Sean Deborah, Barbara Davis, and Bill Whalen were the program's first attorneys. Bill Whalen may be Bill Herman's last attorney, he's still with us. The Legal Aid Service of the Buncombe County Bar Association was incorporated in 1978, and the first grant funds were used to purchase the old Victorian house on Montford Avenue, which many of you helped to work on. It was very was supposed to get away from the office and out in the field to help promote community development activities. Scott Deborah, who's here with the front row with the white shirt on, had been hired as the community educator just before I arrived. So Scott and I worked on a number of projects. He did community organizing, and much more than that. And I did legal work in housing cases and economic development projects. We concentrated on the tremendous need for decent, affordable housing. You think there's a need now, it was quite a need back then. For the first 5 years after 1983, we struggled to get Asheville to allocate more of its federal dollars, community redevelopment dollars, for housing. And we advocated that Asheville should enforce its rental housing code to ensure safe housing for people with lower incomes. Asheville was losing much of its aging housing stock to dilapidation because disreputable landlords were not making repairs. We brought many cases in court to enforce the housing code, and we worked with the fire chief who is here tonight on the second row to revise and enforce the housing code across the city. And for a while, that housing code was studied by many other cities because it was so effective. That was before certain city council got rid of it. We became frustrated that the housing authority could not or would not expand its efforts to rehab more housing and develop more rental housing. And when the federal government created the Affordable Housing Tax Credit Program, Scott organized a housing conference sponsored by PLS and invited developers, realtors, government officials, and others to learn about the new tax credit program to create more affordable housing. In follow-up meetings after the conference, we realized that we needed to establish another organization to take advantage of tax credits. We created a nonprofit called Mountain Housing Opportunities. As I recall it, Cindy Lewis was the first director. Scott Devin and Gray Wilson of PLS were board members, along with several other community members. In 1993, Scott left PLS to become the director of MHO, with Cindy as the development expert. And MHO now serves more than 600 households each year and builds an average of more than 60 new homes each year. To assist the growing number of people who were homeless in the 1980s, PLS helped to establish the Coalition for the Homeless to coordinate services. We also helped to incorporate a hospitality house that operated a homeless shelter in the basement of the captive facility. That's where it was first, and then it was in the basement of St. Matthias Episcopal Church. And many of you helped volunteer in that facility. We helped get funding for what became the AHO program of the organization, that eventually changed its name to Homeward Bound. And as you know, Homeward Bound has helped hundreds of people who are homeless, especially those who are chronically homeless, to find and keep housing. Scott also encouraged the creation of the nonprofit Neighborhood Housing Services in 1989 to rehabilitate housing in the Montford neighborhood. Physical legal services' role in the housing arena continues to be to prevent homelessness by stopping unnecessary evictions and foreclosures, helping people who are homeless due to disability or domestic violence, and advocating for more funding and services to preserve and develop affordable housing. Most of our clients are paying well over what the government says is affordable for housing costs. 1/3 of our cases are housing related, and 1/3 come to us to address domestic violence. I have some materials at the back if you're interested. We have our annual report and the newsletter. And I thank you all.
Good evening. Can you hear me now? Yes. They said to put it close. My name is Deborah. I'm the director of this UNC Asheville Center for Diversity Education. But if you can go back 41 years to 1975, I was driving through the gorge on I-40 coming to the Allen Center on August 15th, 1975. I was a recent college graduate from Hendrix College in Conway, Arkansas. I'm from Arkansas. And I met these wonderful people, Dick and Mary Gilbert. Dick and Mary amazing visionaries. They're the hardest working people I know. They understand community development and the vision of what kind of human world we could be with each other. And everything except for my mom and daddy, everything I learned I learned from So we developed a bunch of projects. Carolyn Wallace was a part of this also. I'll talk a little bit about some of the stuff she did in a minute. But we were standing on the shoulders of a community that had been working hard for social justice for a long time, and that was the Allen Homeschool. It was started in the 1880s by women from the Methodist Episcopal Church, and later was run by the women of the United Methodist Church. And this was a school for African American women across the South who were looking for a pre-collegiate education. If you've ever driven up College Street just before you go into the tunnel, on the left-hand side is a set of buildings. That was Allen. The school worked until about 1973-74, and by then desegregation had happened, and the school needed to be repurposed. The folks who were coming were not college-bound, which is what this school was used to working with, including Nina Simone and also Dorothy Counts, who integrated the Charlotte school system. Amazing, amazing women. So Dick and Mary came from Alaska to the Allen Center in 1974 and began to put together a center for nonprofits. The dormitory became a home for the United Way, Family Services Center, a bunch of other nonprofits. The classrooms became home for the Children's Grammar School and the Alternative School for Asheville City. The cafeteria became the Asheville Junction. And I see Deborah Austin here and a bunch of other people. You know, back in those days, there weren't all these things to do all over Asheville. Right? I like to say we made our own fun. We had a lot of fun. It was amazing. At the same time, the folks at Allen, Dick and Mary and Carol and a whole bunch of other people were working with Caring for Children, which came out of Central United Methodist Church, Sunday school here, on creating our place emergency shelter. And if you know where the Girl Scouts headquarters is now, that's where our place emergency shelter was. We would work with young people who couldn't live at home and otherwise had been put in jail for 30 days until they could find a foster home for them. And I was a shelter parent back in those days, all my 21 years of age. Amazing, amazing. And I love that he said social entrepreneurial. Ellen did, because that's exactly the next amazing brainchild of Dick and Mary. You know, if you do nonprofit work, you get really sick of always begging for money. You got to find grants, you got to cultivate donors, all this kind of stuff. So this was 1977, 78. We started looking at, well, maybe we could start a moving company. Or maybe we could start a secretarial company. But there were no restaurants. And Mary is an amazing cook, right? So we started Stone Soup, and the whole purpose of Stone Soup was to make money for the programs we were working on. But at that point, Dick and Mary were not only doing this restaurant work with all the rest of us, they had a group home. And a lot of the young people from the group home worked at Stone Soup. So in addition to the group home work, we also started a hotline for, there were a number of suicides among high school students, and Carolyn Wallace worked on Huckleberry on the hotline. In addition, and you can probably hear this faith tradition running through the kind of work of the Pair of the World. The folks who were in this started a religious community, a faith-based community called Friends, and we would gather and have rituals of reminding ourselves why this work mattered. There were all other kinds of folks who were involved in this. Bob Smith, who went on to work at Asheville Buncombe Community Relations Council. Howard and Lois Johnson, who started a sprout company, and may have brought our sprouts at Ingalls many years ago. This also eventually became a worker-owned business. And a lot of the social entrepreneurial work went into cultivating worker ownership. And some of that was inspired by the work of E.F. Schumacher. Did I say his name? Who wrote the book Small is Beautiful. And we really looked at what is the relationship of income between the highest paid and the lowest paid. How do we create equity across that continuum? Stone Soup operated at Allen Center, and then it moved to the Manor in the late 1970s. It moved to Broadway in about 1983. I remember that because that's when we had our first child. And then And finally, in a different incarnation, it was at Blue Moon. So if you worked at Blue Moon, would you raise your hand? I know we've got a bunch of people at Blue Moon. Good. Thank y'all for continuing to find this tradition. And let's see what else I've got on. Bob went on to found the Asheville Buncombe, to continue the work of the Asheville Buncombe Community Relations Council. And Carolyn was the first director of Man of Food Bank. So you can see all the leadership skills that came out of that work. And really my favorite story, of course, about all of that work that we created together is that I met my husband, Mark Real. He was that fiddling guy at Asheville Junction. So thanks everybody. Blog that Zoe created, and the last picture is I'm in the soup kettle. Okay, that was the soup kettle, and this was the last day of our being at the Allen Center, and it was bittersweet that we left Allen. Allen was again being repurposed, and fortunately we found this beautiful on the manor. So I came dressed with my swimsuit underneath, and I said, I've always wanted to do this. So I filled up the card and I jumped in.
Hi, I'm Jeff Phobes, and I'm a late comer to the 80s. I did get here in time to go to the Stone Soup Blues with the man. And that was one of the things that impressed me about Asheville and got me to move here, among other things. One of the things that I saw was, I couldn't believe it, when I went to check out, there was a guy standing behind an Apple computer, and he had turned into a cash register. So far ahead of his time. And I knew this was a strange place. I continued to enjoy Asheville for a few years after that. And then in '87, encountered the WNC Green Party that was forming. And was really impressed with the 10 key values and the sensibilities that they brought to the situation. And I thought, well, we could get some social change here. And said to them that, well, you need a newsletter. You got to tell people your story. You're not going to create social change unless you change the people out there. And they said, you mean a newsletter? And I said, no, I do not need a newsletter. It's got to be a newspaper, and it needs to be on newsprint. Because I knew that, like that Apple cash register, the desktop publishing had just happened, just was occurring, and that we had a chance of a lifetime. That the technological solution to produce a newspaper was suddenly upon us, and the stranglehold that the media had on the American public could be broken. That it didn't take millions and millions of dollars to put out a daily paper, because we didn't want to do it daily. First, we said maybe a monthly. So we put out a newspaper. The budget was $200 a month. So $150 to get it printed at Iwana, and that was fine, except when we wanted to have a story about Jesse Helms on the front page, and the proofs, the page proofs, I saw them get carried up to the owner of Iwana. I was ready to blow my top. If he said no, we're not printing it out, I don't know exactly what I would have done, but in the regard to the budget, I'm a lot like the nonprofits that because I didn't come at this as a business, never been a businessman particularly. So what we did was all volunteer work. This was an experiment. My sense was that if we could tell the stories of the community with kind of a global backdrop, that we are trying to exist in a changing world, that we could foment change. And I think we did a little bit. I'm curious to know how many people here have ever written or perhaps even worked or volunteered at Greenline, if you remember Greenline. There's a few, I guess, in there. And when we really got good, actually after a while we started selling ads, which was an interesting experiment. The earliest advertisers were, let's see, Malaprops, accent on books. Jewels of Dance, although it was jewelry design. There's some more, but at least gives you a sense that there were some early adopters in the advertising field. That allowed us to pay the writers $5 a story. So we were into the big time. Let's see, so it took a lot of work. It started out as the newspaper or newsletter, however you want to call it, of the WNC Greens. We started selling ads. By the end of the year, it morphed into just an independent paper. And the Greens kind of went on and did their thing. And we tried to at least continue the spirit of it, of that party, but not be tied to a particular political group. Let's see, what was mostly environmental coverage. I had to learn a lot in the beginning because I really didn't know a whole lot about this community. I didn't know all these stories I'm listening to. I'm having a great time listening to it because I didn't know this stuff, and some of it I still don't. I'm learning it for the first time. So I'm unaware of all the amazing things that were going on in Asheville leading up to Green Line's inception. So then it became a process of trying to tell people's stories or help them tell stories. We didn't have any money, so we came up with an idea called it citizen journalism, so that it'd be a collaborative nature. That got involved with the League of Women Voters, trying to get them to go to city council and the county commission and report on what was happening there. And that was a good low-budget solution, although they sure didn't know newspaper reporting style. Our copy editor was Wally Bowen, who's no longer with us, but a lot of you know Wally. He showed us AP style. So a lot of our stories were about environmental issues, but not big social justice. I'm just thinking one of the first big ones was opposing the French Broad Drinking Water bond referendum. That was a great experiment or experience. I remember calling up all the elected officials saying, "What will you do if the bond referendum fails?" And every single one of them said, "We will go ahead with this project." And I said, "You mean if the people say they don't want it, you'll do it anyhow?" And they said, "Yes, each one." So that was the story. And I thought that's amazing in itself. And of course, the people who are here know that that bond referendum failed. I had a great time putting up hundreds of posters that said, "Yuck, vote no." Showed an industrial pipe feeding into the water and the glass water. One of the gratifying moments was running into Dick Wood on the street, and he said to me, Dick Wood was a former mayor of Asheville, head of the Water Authority, he was the attorney representing the Citizen Times, WLOS, and I can't remember if he was ever city manager, but this guy got around. And he said to me, what I could do if I had a newspaper. You arrive somewhere. We will make a change. And let's see, one other quick story. Distributing the paper was always fun because it put me in touch with, well, okay, you write this stuff, you publish this stuff, what happens when you put it out there? Some people didn't like it, so we got called tree huggers, don't want that paper around here. Or the fag rag, that's another good one. But the biggest obstacle to distributing Green Line, which then became Mountain Express, I can describe it. The biggest obstacle was on Tunnel Road and Patton Avenue going out into West Asheville, because that area, those areas are owned by corporate America. Corporate America doesn't care about community. Corporate America doesn't care about our community. They care about selling things in our community, but we've got to stand up for ourselves like all these great people are.
But I've been asked to share about AIDS in the believe that's when a tiny seed was planted. So then the next day that I have marked in here that I found was October 15th. That one is a day of jubilation because that's the day I made it back to Buncombe County in Asheville and started at the Buncombe County Health Department. I was hired to do worksite health promotion. I may have taught some of you all. It wasn't a very short-lived job duty though, because a little over a month later, I call this the day everything changed. And that was November 25th. And that was also the day that a young gay man, that I'll call Randy because I never got his permission to use his name, but he came in unannounced to the health department. And he said he had AIDS and he wanted to know what the health department was going to do about it. He was brave and he was desperate and he was quickly escorted from the front desk up to my department and eventually to me, I guess because I'd gone to that AIDS workshop. So I remember listening to Randy and I also remember saying something like, well, I've just gotten here and I don't know many people, especially gay men, and I need your help. Would you help me form a group of people so we can figure out what's going to happen at our community? Well, then soon, thanks to Dr. Tenney, who was the health director then, and who we got a great deal of support from this issue, changed my job description almost immediately and made room for me to focus on AIDS and work with the community. This wasn't a health department response, let me be clear. I'm representing a community response. And as Randy promised, we had several more meetings in 1985. I saw on November 25th. We had a meeting on December 19th and squeezed another one in December 30th. The more I learned, the more I already knew too many people were getting infected and too many people were already dying. We couldn't waste any more time. So since I have a limited time, that's my story on how I kind of got to this issue. But there are three things that I think shaped our community's response to AIDS. Number one, we had local champions that joined together, just like we do on everything we do here. Everybody will, we play prettier in the sandbox than any, or we act like it. So. Anyway, so the local champions joined together. The first of the champions, I would have to say, is Closer, the lesbian and gay support group, of which so many wonderful volunteers sprang from. Another group was Parents and Friends of Lesbian and Gays, and if any of you all knew Dan and Joe Marshall, who, oh my gosh, they helped us all the way through this journey, I'm telling you. So many faces, many gay men and women, but as time went on, it came from organizations, people that had other jobs and volunteered. We did have speakers bureaus and educators and sex education, fundraisers, and we supported people who had AIDS. And then there were those who worked diligently. And it took a couple of years almost to get our 501c3 tax exempt status. I was one that was kind of a convener on that, but we had lots of specialists that helped us through that journey, which also meant that we needed people to serve on boards of directors and committees, because you had to have that, you had to have the structure actually before you could walk away. But one person stands out, and I've connected with a turning point in our community. His name is Dr. Terrence Lee. He was with Asheville Infectious Disease. I see some of you all nodding. He was a trusted leader and champion in this issue, and it especially came at a time when we had a 15-year-old young person come to our community and they had HIV and wanted to enroll at Asheville High School. And I don't know if you remember, it was August of 1987. The 15-year-old would become the first student known to have HIV who attended North Carolina public schools. The fear and misinformation was huge, but basically Dr. Lee and some others on the panel on that stage, faced the scared and angry, really confused crowd of people. And by the end of the night, I remember feeling just victorious because he had helped lead them through. The crowd remained civil, and people got information that they trusted, because it was from Dr. Lee, and the student was able to attend school. So there's lots of those kind of stories. The conquering of fear, person by person, neighbor by neighbor, was just exhausting. But the last I want to recognize is to acknowledge the trailblazers that shared their resources and inspired us to form the AIDS Project. We studied, we sought the help and advice of those who had gone before us. I mean, we bugged those people at Shanti Project in San Francisco. We talked to the folks at Gay Men's Health Crisis up in New York. We talked to the folks that actually visited folks down in Charlotte at Metrolina AIDS Project. One of the things that I thought you would be interested to know was a sign of what was really going on then is taking the lead from other programs, we put a lot of effort into forming what's called a buddy program. And that's where lay volunteers are trained and then matched up with somebody who is dying with AIDS. It was sort of like a AIDS hospice kind of thing. There was a lot of need for this program because many of the people who had AIDS back then were shunned by their families. So we were family and loved them through their passing. So, in 1986, we started laying the bones that formed the AIDS Project, which is now celebrating its 30th anniversary. Around 1988 is when we got the nonprofit status, which really opened up the doorway to allow the funding that helped that agency thrive and grow. I served on the education committee. I am a health educator. Deep down and through all of this, I rotated off and on the board of directors. I don't know how many times. I retired in 2014 after 30 years in public health service, and I still support the AIDS Project. So I will end with this. During the 80s and 90s, we're a government agency, so of course I had to submit a report every month. And I would have long lists of AIDS activities and projects. I worked days and nights and weekends, we all did, most of which we probably didn't even get compensated for. But there was something else that never did appear on the report, and that is the caring relationships I formed, especially with gay men and women, who taught me so much about how to love and care for one another. The time I had been able to help others who were or are struggling with the issue of whether AIDS is a curse from God. And the belief, as I remember the faces of people I've encountered along this journey, that I feel I indeed have seen the face of my Creator.
So I'm just going to take a few more minutes to talk about the work that I was involved with in the 70s and 80s, and it was around women's rights. When I moved to Asheville in 1978, I had been very involved in women's issues in Raleigh, North Carolina, and Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and wanted to continue that, but didn't know way building where they produced a community service directory, and it had a list of organizations. And there was a rape crisis center listed in there. So I contacted them, and at the same time I learned that the Community Relations Council, which was also housed in the Allen Center, I would like to say the Allen Center really was an incubator for nonprofits. It was way ahead of its time. This was, in the 70s. And the Community Relations Council had a department, which was the commission, Buncombe County Commission on the Status of Women. And they had just conducted a survey to find out the extent of domestic violence in Buncombe County. So I had the Rape Crisis Program, which had grown out of the Women's Center at the YWCA, and then this Battered Women's Task Force. The Women's Center, I'll talk a little bit about that, and then about Helpmate. They're two separate organizations and two separate issues in many ways, but my involvement with them sort of crossed over in some interesting ways in terms of what those two organizations were attempting to do. The Women's Center, which was organized by a group of women at the YWCA, was really trying to understand how to take control of our lives. And some of you will remember the book, Our Bodies, Ourselves. It was a seminal health book for women. It was the first time that many of us had a manual written for lay people that explained what happens to you when you get pregnant, what happens to you when you have periods, etc. Things that we had never really been able to, information we hadn't been able to access readily. So the whole idea about taking control of our own bodies was a huge theme at that time. The other thing that the Women's Center did was to help women understand what the media messages were to women about their bodies and what was considered beauty and what was considered attractive. And so we were really learning about the media images of women. We were learning about self-defense, how to protect ourselves, how to take control of our lives, essentially. And out of that led the work for the Rape Crisis Center and providing services to victims of rape. The first thing was to establish a hotline to support rape victims so that they could talk to someone. Many of the people that I talked to didn't report it, hadn't told their family members, hadn't told their husband or boyfriend or mother or anyone, and they just needed someone to talk to. And they felt a lot of blame, they were ashamed, they were embarrassed. They felt like people wouldn't really believe them, that they couldn't prove it. And so there were a lot of issues, obviously, for women who have been raped. Some of this sounds familiar, doesn't it? At the same time, the Commission on the Status of Women had done this survey on domestic violence in Buncombe County, and we were going off of an FBI report that estimated for a community our size, we should probably have between 5,000 and 6,000 women in Buncombe County who suffered domestic violence. So we did this survey, and in the survey, which was of law enforcement and social service agencies, public entities, we found out that actually the estimate for Buncombe County was over 7,500 women. So it was even beyond the FBI numbers. So that was a big momentous for us to say we need to do something for battered women. Again, the first thing was to create a hotline so that women could have someone to talk to. Women who called, blamed themselves, they were in fear for their children, they had lost their family support in the course of living with an abuser, had left and returned many times, so they felt isolated. They were in fear of poverty, they lost those other additional sorts of income from their partner, and they were in fear for their life. It sounds familiar, actually. So these two organizations, though completely separate, but with very similar concepts and themes, undertook training people, training volunteers, mostly women. Helpmate, which grew out of the task force on battered women, actually had male volunteers too, which was really important and helpful for us at that time because it helped us get the message out among men that domestic violence isn't okay. It's not just a women's issue, it's a family issue. It's a community issue, and we had men who were willing to stand up and talk about it, which was a big deal. So we got training, those of us who went through the volunteer training, just realized I have to read my notes, got trained in the issue, what the research showed about the topics of sexual assault and domestic violence, how to take crisis calls, how to listen actively, how the local legal system worked, the law enforcement, the DA, the courts, how they handled those cases, how the local medical community handled it, either through the emergency room, the treatment that private physicians gave, the advice that private physicians gave or didn't give to rape victims or women in abusive situations. So we learned as much as we could about what the issue was in our community. And we worked a lot in terms of providing support to women who would contact us, and worked very hard to get the word out that there actually was a place to call and someone to talk to 24 hours a day. And we were hobbling this together with bits of money and lots of volunteer support here and there. But in addition, as it grew and we were understanding more about the system, we wanted to really get the systems who have the authority to handle cases to do a better job of what they were doing. We wanted them to understand victims' perspectives, to think about it for a minute in terms of not just a crime to be solved, but what were the victims' perspectives. We wanted them to allow volunteer support advocates to be with a victim if she chose to do that, and if she knew about it. We wanted them to tell her about community resources, what's available to you in the community. So we wanted them to train the personnel, train the ER doctors, train the law enforcement to be able to handle these cases in more consistent ways and more understanding ways. With the Rape Crisis Center, one of the things that happened is that we got our hands on a protocol from another community of how rape cases should be handled by law enforcement. We thought, this is brilliant. We'll take this to the police chief and the sheriff, and they'll be all excited about it because it'll give them a consistent way to handle these cases. And we walked in there, these, women volunteers in the community with our protocol, and they said, yeah, that's sweet, and set it off to the side, and never would act upon it. We kept trying to get them to. They just couldn't accept an idea from the community, from the volunteer community, and from women. They just couldn't accept it. So it took years to get any kind of a protocol in law enforcement for rape cases. We did get support from mental health. The Mental Health Center, Blue Ridge Center at that time, was very helpful in providing a little bit of money, not a lot, but a little bit of support, some space, money for printing, so that we could put training manuals together, et cetera, and things like that. But we finally got our first paid staff in 1984. And Kevan was our first paid director. I don't know if she's here tonight, but Cassie was really instrumental in taking the Rape Crisis Center onto a more professional level as an organization and really take it to the place it is today. It's now our voice, but it was Rape Crisis back then. With Helpmate, we took women into our homes at first. If they had to get out, we'd take them home with us. In spite of the potential dangers that might pose. We tried to find apartments for them. We had an apartment at the Allen Center for a while. Had an apartment out of Lida Home. We would use the Salvation Army Women's Shelter and just do anything we could to try to get women somewhere safe so they could sort of sort out what they were going to do next. We finally got our first staff shelter in the Montford community in 1984. And a lot of people who lived in Montford were very helpful and very supportive. And Susan Roderick was one of them. Brought us a plate of brownies the first day that shelter opened. It was a big deal because there certainly was opposition to having a battered women's shelter in your neighborhood. But we had some folks who were very supportive and wanted to reach out to women. We had a men's treatment program in the 80s. We had a children's program. And we really tried to do as much as we could with as little as we had to reach the families, because we knew it was a family issue, and we really had to try to get as many people in that family to try to break the cycle so that the abuse wouldn't continue generationally. And the work still continues, obviously. We have the great work that Helpmate does, and now with the shelter, in the Justice Center, where they're combining a lot of resources in one place, is going to be hugely helpful to a lot of women. One of the two stories I want to tell about Helpmate. One is that we had a client who was actually killed by her boyfriend she was babysitting at a home in Asheville. And he broke into the home where she was babysitting. She tried to call the police. They couldn't figure out where she was. Obviously the phone was grabbed away from her. She was murdered. when they finally found her, you know, these 3 little children who she was babysitting with were obviously freaked out, and it was the momentum to get 911 in Buncombe County. Because up to that point, we had been working on it in a lot of different ways, but nothing had really happened. But it was her death that finally mobilized the community, because the police couldn't reach her. They were frantic as well, because they knew something horrible was happening, and they could not figure out where she was. So it helped us get 911 in Buncombe County. On another note, one of the things we tried to do was to have all of the assault on a female cases in one day in court, so that it would be easier for women to have support. They'd be in there with a lot of other women who were in the same situation. It would be helpful for us as an organization, obviously, to have several volunteers who could be there and let our presence be known to those women that there was an organization that would help them. And it would be helpful for the court system to see the extent of the problem by having everybody there at once. You could really see how many assault on a female cases there really were in Buncombe County. And we did that for a number of years, and I'm not sure how long it continued after I left in 1986. But I found out later, I didn't know it at the time, that among the court officials it was known as Meet Your Wife Day, which just hurt my heart. But, you know, I know it was kind of funny, but we really wanted people to understand the extent of domestic violence in our community. Rape and domestic violence just weren't something that were talked about much back in the 70s, and I think that it took some really brave women and men to keep talking about it and to keep pushing and to keep it going, and we still have those folks doing that today. Thank you.
In the 80s, I've been a community organizer here since on a variety of issues, but one that was mostly in the 80s was the effort by the water authority at that time to clear cut the Asheville watershed, which is our 2 watersheds, really, 17,000 and 5,000 acres outside of Black Mountain and Swananoa, Future. And it was a fascinating experience, and I always remember when we learned at that time that we had to know more about it than the people who were doing it. And so we researched the community, we went down to Coweta Hydrological Lab to find out how water, what happened in clear cuts and all of this. And there was tremendous resistance immediately at the beginning. I remember going to a meeting the day that we went public, because we tried, we said, look, if you'll do selection cutting, that's fine, but you don't want to put that whole watershed in a location of clear cut. And so Mayor Bissett saw me there, and it had just come out in the Asheville paper that day, and he said, well, here, you should meet Ralph Morris, the head of the water authority. And the second he heard, he just said, nobody's gonna listen to you. You all would just be treated as troublemakers. And, you know, that was an attitude. But the wonderful thing about Asheville is you can really change things. And over time, we did get the clear cutting stop. And that led, I see Julie Mayfield from Western North Carolina Alliance, Mountain True. We learned a lot from the Western North Carolina Alliance, and they helped us tremendously. When we had a public meeting about it in Black Mountain, they bust in loggers from Waynesville to try to intimidate us. And, but we had Hugh Morgan on our side, and that helped a lot. And I always remember that was also, Ralph Morris helped us also, because he was published in the paper saying he wasn't going to go that. I mean, I called him and asked him if he would come and give the city's side of the issue. He said, I'm not coming out there and be lectured to. I'm not coming to a bloodletting. And so, you know, we had a professor from Warren Wilson and this and that, county commissioner. But anyway, all of that really led to the fight in the Western North Carolina Alliance of the clear cutting campaign. And I noticed there was a picture of that big rally, which led to the U.S. Forest Service changing their priorities from clear cutting, which was the favored harvest technique, to from the favored to the least favored. There are times when we need to do it. And so there are a lot of other things, but I'll stop there.
I'd just like to echo on Habitat's behalf. I'd like to echo on something that Ann said, that Asheville, Asheville is a leader, and in the case of Habitat for Humanity, there are 80 Habitat affiliates in the state of North Carolina today, and the first one was formed here in Asheville in 1983. I also want to echo that these are your heroes here, amongst many of you here tonight. One quick story. Back in the late, I guess it was late 1980s, I remember a family that came to us to apply for a home. The wife in that household was 68, the husband was 70. They had never been homeowners. The reason they needed a place to stay is that they were living in a little apartment that was on 2 floors. I remember visiting them there. The problem was Frankie had diabetes, and it had affected her legs so badly she could not go upstairs anymore. And it happened to be that their only bathroom was upstairs. Her husband had set up a 5-gallon pail with a curtain around it in the living room, and he serviced that every day. At the ages of 69 and 71, actually, they became homeowners for the first time through the efforts of many people in this community with Habitat helping them. I have said for many years that we pride ourselves as a country of not having human rights violations, but we do when it comes to housing. We continue to have that. It's a human right violation when we have cases of that nature right there. In 2008, when we turned 25, I remember the Asheville Citizen-Times came to us and said, where do you want to see Habitat 25 years from now? And our answer was out of business. And they were very confused at first, but we are still in a growth industry, as Scott can certainly attest to. But many thanks to this community and all of you for what you've done. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Scott Dedman with Mountain Housing Opportunities, and thank you, Jim, for your kind comments earlier. I heard from Ann that, some of the details about tonight's event, and I was kind of skeptical. I thought, well, that's a little bit self-congratulatory for me, to show up and the rest of us. I also said if you walk down the street in Asheville, 2 out of every 3 residents you meet probably see themselves as social activists, and so I'm the one who made the distinction to Ann between calling for something, advocating for something versus doing something, getting up in the morning to in a worker-owned restaurant like Dick and Mary Gilbert, Carolyn Wallace, and as early as you have to get up and as late as you go to bed for 20, 30 years, I don't even know how many years it was. It's a saintly thing to do that much, as many of us know that Dick and Mary Gilbert did, and Carolyn Wallace. That's really activism, is getting up every day and doing it and making it happen for people in need. One publication, I heard them promoting their philosophy one time, and they said, we want to give a voice to those who are the most active in our community. And on first thought, I admired that. On second thought, I wanted to note that those who are most active are not always working for justice. And people out there in our world who are extremely active as can be, and who are not working for the poor and are not working for justice and social justice. And so it's the word activism that I'm throwing a cautionary note about. It's like, help people, serve people. Please don't just be active, but be active for the right way and for good. Beth Maska, who's now the executive director of the YWCA and who was an early leader of the Self-Help Credit Union's Asheville branch and a leader for many years of the Affordable Housing Coalition, asked me to bring this publication. It's called the Housing Report Card. It's from 1992, but 6 of the 9 organizations involved were started in the 1980s. It was distributed, 40,000 copies were distributed in the Asheville Citizen-Times, and we gave a D+ grade in this housing report card, and it says in handwriting, as if the teacher had written it, has worked hard all year but is losing ground, runs the risk of failing without much additional effort, D+. And it breaks down home ownership, repair of substandard housing, fair housing, housing discrimination, rental code enforcement, which John Ruckabina was a huge supporter of strong rental housing code enforcement. But I want to present this to the library as a history of housing and affordable housing efforts from the 1980s and all the way into 1992. I consider it an important historic document for Asheville and Buncombe County. But thank you all.
My name is Carolyn Wallace, and I just want to say that I am so touched by this tonight. I didn't know I was going to cry either, but to be in the same room with so many people who have worked so hard to make Western North Carolina the kind of place we all want to live in, it touches me very deeply in my heart. And it touches me that this is not a Donald Trump, what do you call those things he has, rally, whatever you call it. And it's full of people who are interested in the history of our community and what people have done and are doing and will continue to do to make it what it is. And I'm just so touched by that. This is going to take me a long way here in the next days of my life. And it makes me think of that Margaret Mead quote that so many of us have loved for so long. Never doubt what a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can do to change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And we're going to all keep doing that. People in this room, people who care, and people who come after us. And I'm very grateful to be a part of a group like everybody who's here tonight. And I thank y'all for making sure that this is kept alive in terms of the knowledge base. We need to know our history. We need to know what we've done and we are doing and we will do. So thank you very much.
I just wanted to make a comment. Number one, I'm in a room full of superheroes, and the work that you started doing, the work that you're still doing, it's the incentive for me to do the small things that I do every day. Thank you for that. Galen, I wanted to say you started the Western North Carolina AIDS Project with those early innovators. You created a place for people to go to die. 30 years later, you created a place that people go to live. So thank you for that. It wouldn't be Asheville if I just had one thing that I'm passionate about WinCap. I'm the current president of the board. Affordable housing is huge on my list. What Jim Barrett does at Pisgah Legal. 15,000 people he served last year, Jim. I mean, it's just amazing. You and your team, I'm just so fortunate that I live here in this community with people like this as an incentive. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm Julie Mayfield. I wear two hats in this town. And the first thing, well, one of it is co-director at Mountain True, which used to be the Western North Carolina Alliance. And I want to, Monroe, I think, might have led you to believe that we were the ones who trucked in the loggers from Waynesville, and we did not do that. I think we helped you prepare for that. So, and with that hat on, what I want to say is I am a newbie to this community. I have been here only 8 years, and I am so well aware that in my role at Mountain True, I stand on the shoulders of giants. You people are amazing, and thank you so much for the legacy that you've created. With my other city council hat on, I want to say essentially the same thing. Thank you for creating this unbelievable town that I have come to live in and I have fallen in love with. And I am so proud to be hopefully helping continue to lead into a great future. We need all of these organizations that still exist today, and the city couldn't do what we need to do without you, and hopefully we're going to be a good partner. I hope that I will personally be a good partner in continuing the work that you do. So just thank you so very much.
Any other comments or questions?
Do you all have any plans, excuse me, do you all have any plans on taking this roadshow to Leicester? Taking this roadshow to Leicester and maybe even as far as Hendersonville?
Not that I know.
It needs to be done.
It's a good point, and maybe if there are groups, in those communities that would like to sponsor that. I mean, this is on behalf of the North Carolina Room and Buncombe County, so Leicester certainly is part of that, meets that criteria, but maybe you can encourage folks, in Henderson County to do something similar, because there were some things happening in Henderson County, a few, and it would be a chance to talk about that. Any other comments? Thank you all, it's been a fabulous day.